It's the only way to get out of this. It's not by taxing people out of our city or out of our state.
And at the end of the day, what we're talking about are sugar highs. And everyone knows what happens after the sugar high wears off. You crash.
Welcome to the Mendoza Podcast, financial talk that makes sense. I'm your Illinois State Controller, Susana Mendoza, and I want to help answer all the questions you have about money matters, but we're maybe afraid to ask. We're going to learn a lot and have some fun together. Hi, welcome back to the Mendoza Podcast. Today, we are so lucky to have a really special guest, Joe Ferguson, president of the Civic Federation, whose analysis of state and local budgets I've always really, truly appreciated. Thank you, Joe. There's a ton of issues we want to cover today, so let's talk about the state and city budgets. Let's talk about pensions. Let's see how much ground we can cover in a short amount of time. I can tell you that he and I could talk for hours. We're going to not do that today, but we're going to try to hit some key topics that I know are real challenges, concerns, and that people care about. So, Joe, you have been a federal prosecutor. You've been an inspector general for the city of Chicago. That's where I met you when I was city clerk of Chicago years ago. And now you're the president of the Civic Federation. Now you replace my good friend, I would say our good friend, Lawrence Masal, who we all obviously miss a ton. He was such an amazing, great guy. And I'm sure he'd be proud of the work that you're doing in his stead. But to get started with our little podcast, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? I already hit on some key points. But more importantly, tell our audience a little bit that they should know about the work that the Civic Federation does.
Sure, appreciate it. Thanks for having me here.
Of course.
Appreciate the show. As you indicated, many years as a federal prosecutor. A lot of that was devoted to post 9/11 work on chasing money around the world related to terrorism and nexus to terrorist organizations. So I was a financial investigator and prosecutor by and large. And before I got to midlife crisis and had to decide whether or not to buy a sports car, I decided to step into a highly politicized arena of being the Inspector General for the city of Chicago, which is a nonpartisan job, and it does investigations, obviously, and performance audits of government functions to identify ways that government can and should be delivering services more efficiently at lower cost, which is the long arc of what I've been doing for a long time.
You're speaking to my heart.
Absolutely.
Government, better services at lower cost. Amen. We need more of that.
Worked under, as Inspector General, 3 separate mayors. Mayor Daley appointed me. Rahm Emanuel reappointed me twice. First time somewhat reluctantly, and the second time when asked by Fran Spielman why, said he's the devil that I know. And that's the fine line that Inspector General is supposed to walk, is to call things balls and strikes straight up. Usually it's going to be something that those actually in seats of power aren't going to like having said publicly, but one of the things about Rahm is, and I call him Rahm now, we were frenemies and then became somewhat friends, is he came to appreciate the importance of that for government to be in a continual improvement process. And the third of the mayors that I worked under didn't like that so much. And that was Mayor Lightfoot, so I was not reappointed. And after taking a break and teaching for a couple of years, you mentioned Lawrence Masal. So the Civic Federation is a 132-year-old organization founded by what constituted diversity in 1894. A banker, Lyman Gage, who was the founder of the First National Bank of Chicago, which is now J.P. Morgan Chase, our biggest bank here. Bertha Palmer of the Palmer House.
Who also, by the way, invented the brownie. Did you know that?
Absolutely, I know that.
Yes.
But philanthropist and devoted to social causes. And then the third person who was in the core of the founders was Jane Addams. Nobel Prize winning activist for immigrant communities, all of this at a point in time when we were at the end of the Gilded Age and the beginning of the progressive era, and big cities had to figure out what they needed to be in order to meet the confluence of people, immigrants, migrants, in growing industry and all of that. And that's when we came to understand we need cities for clean water, for good transportation, for good public schools, so on and so forth. And so the core mission of the Civic Federation then is the same as it is today. Nonpartisan, objective, research-based advocacy for the improvement of government services. And in this age, it's important to add the word equitably.
So, Joe, we're about to start budget season for the state of Illinois. We're kind of in it already. The governor in February is going to propose his budget. I'm sure everyone's going to weigh in, as everyone does, but you guys especially are a trusted source of analysis for both the state of Illinois' budget, also the city of Chicago's budget, which is further along in the year. You were very vocal in this last budget. But where do you think the state needs to go in this next budget season? You guys are already starting to analyze what's happening statewide.
Absolutely, and we do a front-running report to say these are the big issues that we're going to be watching for, that are being attended to. We have a different version of what happened last year. Last year, the budget cycle was occurring at the very beginning of the Trump administration. We weren't really sure what was coming. We could see the storm clouds. We now know what is coming our way, but we don't know the direct fiscal consequences of it.
Yeah.
And so we have to budget not only for the structural issues we need to attend to separate and apart from Washington, but also need to factor for the fact that a lot of money is being pulled from Washington. Let me give you one example that I know concerns you and should concern everybody all the way to ground locally. And I emphasize the locally because what happens is when we talk about one unit of government's budget, we tend to talk about one unit of government's budget. And these are all connected.
It's
Everything
a domino
is
effect.
connected.
100%.
Absolutely.
I'm glad you said that.
And so we need to talk about the collateral effects. And so what the state does with something like Medicaid and how it responds and the degree to which it can respond. And the governor's been very clear, and he's right. The state doesn't have the capacity to stand in the role and fill the gap of the federal government. So how we do that as it flows down, because ultimately a lot of state money coming from the federal government is going down to localities.
For sure.
We have a crisis there, not just with respect to vulnerable populations, but with respect to the fact that a huge critical component of our health system, the safety net hospitals, are going to tip into absolute crisis. We're going to
100%.
absolutely lose those institutions.
I mean, Joe, I can attest to that as controller. I mean, it's my job to pay the state's bills, to determine how we go about paying the state's bills. So for people who don't know how this works, the governor introduces a budget. The legislature then reviews the governor's budget, and then they start to negotiate their own version of what they want to see in that budget. All these negotiations happen behind the scenes, some very publicly, but at the end of the day, in May, they stay till May 32nd, as we call it usually, because at midnight the clock stops and they have to, per the Constitution, get the budget done by May 31st under the normal rules of passing a budget. So these guys go until like the wee hours of May 32nd, as we like to say, and finally get to a budget. That's the appropriation process, the legislative process with the governor. Once the governor signs that budget and it becomes law, that's where I come in, because now the budget is a reflection of what the legislature and the governor agree has to be funded by the state of Illinois. So it's a certain amount of revenue. Let's say it's a $50 billion budget. That means that the legislature and the governor agreed that they're going to fund $50 billion worth of programming in the state of Illinois. That could be schools, hospitals, police departments, firehouses, roads, whatever, whatever it is that we send money to, nursing homes. My office makes sure that those bills get paid, but I have to determine what the prioritization of those payments are going to look like. So they don't tell me how to do that. The governor doesn't, the legislature doesn't, just like I don't tell them what has to go in their budgets, right? I can make recommendations or suggestions, but it's their job to do that, and it's my job to figure out how to go about paying the bills. And there's strategy to that. It's really important because we don't pay in a first in, first out, right? And maybe people think we do, like they just send me a bill and I just pay it. That's not what happens at all. It's very strategic, as a matter of fact, because when I first took office, Medicaid bills were at the back of the line for payment. And Medicaid bills primarily go to pay for, like the most obvious would be a lot of hospital care, people in nursing homes, in hospice care. Those are all Medicaid bills for the most part. And every time I pay $1 worth of Medicaid bills, the federal government essentially gives me a 50-cent match. So it was so crazy to pay Medicaid bills last, because oftentimes the period would lapse where you were even eligible for the federal match. We were leaving hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars on the table. So I changed that, and I said Medicaid bills, number one, it's the morally correct thing to do to take care of our most vulnerable first. And number two, it's absolutely the fiscally smart thing to do because I get 50 cents on every dollar that I pay off. So think of me like your coupon controller, right? Stretching the value of that dollar to be $1.50 in debt payments. But, you know, this issue, I'm getting phone calls every day from hospital presidents, especially the safety nets, freaking out about what's happening at the federal level. And I was getting those phone calls all the time before we had this, you know, instability and unpredictability on federal funding. So I will absolutely, exclamation point, highlight what you just said in the context of how scary this is and what it truly means for safety net hospitals in some of the most needy and poorest communities in our city and our state. Because safety net hospitals are not just in Chicago, they're in rural areas as well. Can very likely shut their doors and leave complete hospital deserts in communities that have been serviced for many, many years. And it's so wrong.
And I think that there isn't an appreciation, and we hope at the Civic Federation to actually elevate this as an issue. We tend to think of those things as affecting only disadvantaged communities. Actually, it's part of a larger network. And so what happens is if there starts to be those community serving hospitals and medical institutions that close, where those folks have to go is to the private sector hospitals and more affluent communities. And suddenly those folks, so we're not talking, let's talk about Chicago, just the south and west side. We're talking Chicago as a whole, and we're actually talking about the region. And that's why for the first, maybe the first time ever, the private hospitals are talking to the publicly funded hospitals, because what's going to happen is folks go and hospitals can't turn away people
and they
at all.
don't want that. I mean, have you been to Northwestern? No offense to Northwestern, that's my hospital. Have you been there?
I have.
On any given day or on the weekend, the emergency room is just full of people. It's jam-packed. It could take you hours, if not over a day, to actually get attended to. And because they're absorbing all of this already. Imagine how much worse it's going to get when one of these hospitals closes.
And there's institutions like Lori, which is in an affluent neighborhood, that's significant private funding. People assume it's affluent. It is the primary provider of Medicaid patients who are juveniles.
That's right.
So everybody sends kids there.
Well, I mean, it's the greatest children's hospital in the state and one of the best in the country. But you're absolutely right. When I used to represent as a state representative the Little Village community, Brighton Park, and back of the Yards, Gage Park, that was my district. I was the champion. If you were to ask Pat Magoon back in the day, who was the president of the hospital, and Susie Gordon, who just retired, who was amazing, who their number one champion for that hospital was, it was me. And I say that unequivocally because even though they weren't in my district, I realized that they serviced every kid who needed to get to the hospital, because any parent is going to want to send their kid to the best hospital. And we're lucky to have an institution like Lurie's. But, you know, again, they can only absorb so much before everything breaks down.
And when you're
That's
talking
where we're
about,
at.
and when you're talking, that is where we're at. There's no buffer. And there's about to be the string pulled on money that they rely upon to operate day to day. But they are not in when we're talking about the south and west side, those are major employers in those communities as well. And so there's further ripple effect. And so everything is connected. And so we're talking about the state budget. We're actually talking about facts on the ground here in the city of Chicago.
Yeah, and I will take it further south. If you go to Carbondale, I mean, the Southern Illinois healthcare system is the number one employer. It's not even the university, right? It's like, that's part of it, but it's the university with the healthcare system. It's an entire regional economy. And so one of those healthcare systems shuts down, I mean, it is a major impact, not just from a healthcare perspective, but also from an economic and financial one.
Economic well-being as well as personal
That's exactly
health
right.
well-being.
Well, and it's also economic well-being for the state overall because of the revenue loss, right? But also economic well-being for people who can go bankrupt because they might not be insured, but they have one medical condition that you can't afford to pay for. Will bankrupt any family who's, you know, who gets sick. You can't afford to get sick, literally.
And that's one issue for this state budget in which there are numerous issues for which there's federal implications. We're all sort of examining what the impact is going to be on a withdrawal of SNAP benefits or a reduction there. And what we have is this hovering situation in which the Trump administration is making noises that they're going to hold back funding from blue states. And so...
Well, they're not making noises, they're moving in that direction.
They're moving to do that.
Thankfully, there's been lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit that has stopped them from doing that. But nonetheless, I mean, I feel the heat because I do get the calls all the time from service providers or hospitals or non-for-profits and saying, like, are we going to be okay? And right now, we're okay. I mean, I think that the state has shown some forethought in preparing for, it's hard to say that we don't know what we don't know, but we know that we're in a situation where we don't know what we don't know. So you have to prepare for what you don't know. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, it makes sense. And one thing, as you were talking about your job and what happens after the budget's passed, and you use the word prioritizing, it's the right word, but I think there's a slightly different word there. It doesn't mean that you're deciding which of the agencies and which of the programs get how much money. That's decided by the state law and by the appropriation. It's the sequencing. And one of the things...
It's when I pay it.
It's when you pay
That's
it,
right.
in the order that you pay it. And the sequencing is really important because many of the flow down effects of dollars are going to individuals, but also entities, service providers who operate at the margin. And if they have to wait too long, they go out of business in real time.
Bingo.
And so it's a really complicated...
I'm super cognizant of that. I mean, when I walked in on December 5th of 2016, I had a $17 billion well, not on that day, but we were getting towards a $17 billion backlog of unpaid bills. But on that day, the average delay in paying those providers that you just mentioned was 210 business days. That's like 9.5 months. So over the last 4 years, we've had a oldest bill, not an average, but the oldest bill in my shop has been 13 days. Now, I have been critiqued actually publicly for paying too fast. Because it is true, we could make a few extra bucks for the state in a high interest environment by holding on to that money a little longer. But if you talk to providers the way I do, whether it's a small business or even a large business, or it's a non-for-profit, they are still recovering from the aftermath of a 736-day budget impasse, where many of these folks had to even double, triple mortgage their homes. They had tapped into every line of credit and couldn't get any more. And it's really important to remember that this isn't our money. It's actually their money. These businesses provide the service. They have to pay for their employees to perform that service and then get reimbursed by the state of Illinois. So, you know,
Yeah, and I don't think people appreciate
people
that.
don't
They
understand
are fronting,
that.
They're
fronting
the
the expense of doing business with us. And so I look at this as like, I want them to get their money as quickly as humanly possible. And I also think from a competitive advantage and a, you know, symbolically say, look, we are open for business. We want people to want to do business in our state. And I want them to look at Illinois as a place where if you do business with us, we're going to pay you quickly. We're going to pay you quicker than the private sector does. And it also incentivizes entities who want to do business with us to not increase the cost of the bid for the work because they have to factor in the fact that they're not going to get paid timely. So we're paying super fast. Gone are the days of paying interest payments because we're late on our bills. I mean, it's really like a culture shift, I think, that is really important at the state level. There's a lot of work,
It's needed at the city level as well.
The other thing, too, that is true. But, you know, the other thing on paying bills fast, which nobody thinks about, is that this allows me as controller to, given the uncertainty of what's coming, is to think ahead. So like the governor's going to have his strategy, the legislature's going to have their strategy with like maybe setting aside funds for things in the event of. We have a $2.4 billion rainy day fund where I had $48,000 when I first took office, so we're in a much better place. But the other thing is that we have a super fast vendor payment cycle. So I'm not at like a 45-day where, God forbid, we have an economic collapse or they pull all this money away from us, that then kicks us into a 90-day payment cycle, and now we're generating late payment interest penalties. So I have to think conservatively all the time when it comes to the finances, err on the side of the caution, and having a 13-day payment cycle, that means we can easily go, if we had to to a 30-day and communicate that to our vendor community that I know trusts me because they know how I think about their needs, right? And say, look, we have to go to a 15-day or we have to go to an 18-day. And that helps to not have to look at the rainy day fund as something that we have to tap into any sooner than we absolutely have to. So there is a method to the madness, but it's actually, I think, very smart fiscal planning, and we have to prepare for the worst. And if we do that, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst.
Absolutely. And there's one other thing about the building of the reserve, though. It's a signal to the financial markets that we rely upon to borrow money, that we're actually fiscally responsible and we understand what the North Star is and where we should be. And that actually factors into our credit rating, which obviously is a huge issue in Chicago right now, for which the state is on a
that's not a woo-woo. They're one notch above junk status. Yep. But for the state, it is. Yep, 10 credit upgrades on my watch. I'm very happy about that.
Sure.
But the city's now very close to, it's on a quick path to junk bond territory, and that's super scary for the city.
Absolutely.
And for me, it is too, because like as controller, I think about all the work that our team has done to help get the state's finances into a position where the state can really prepare itself for an economic, growth spurt. And then at the same time, the city, which is in fact the economic engine and driver of the state as a whole, is moving in the complete opposite direction. And so it's like, oh my goodness, this is why we can't have nice things, right? Because you do need to have responsible adults in the room and say, imagine a scenario where both the city's thriving and the state's thriving. I mean, we could do anything as Illinois.
Yep.
But it's just not the reality that we're in today. But that's why you guys are ever more important, so that you can talk about these policies that both the city and the state should be considering on how to fix this. So let's talk the super fun topic, sarcasm, pensions.
Yeah.
So what do you think we have to do with that? Because in the past, when people would say the pension crisis, and they were referring it to the state. Interesting, right? When people used to think, I still think they do, pension crisis, they think state. But the state is now at 46% funding, which is better than when we started. It's still terrible. It's like the worst in the country, but it seems like the most amazing when you compare it to where the city's at.
Right.
The police have now hit down to about 18%, a little over 17%. They were at a woefully underfunded 25%. Again, the worst in the nation, but now they're at 17%. And that is a crisis. I would say that the state pension issue is more of a challenge, but the city of Chicago's pension is a crisis. And it is like a very scary one. I have a brother who's a police officer, and I worry about, is this pension actually going to be there in a few years? If the stock market gets a cold, I don't even say they get pneumonia, these guys are done. Yeah. And so that's a very stark, but a very real, I think it's a truthful statement as to where we're at right now.
We are at the city level with respect to police and fire because of last year's pension sweetener, which you mentioned the budget cycle and you gave emphasis to the month of May. And that's because the things that are hard and the things that are big tend to come out of nowhere
at the
last second without time for true vetting and without time.
And the things that are the most expensive, by the way.
And that was the pension sweetener bill, which from the time it landed fully, had a hearing, it was voted on 72 hours later. 72 hours is important. That's a reference point for how we ended up with the parking meter deal, right? It's that sort of wisdom. But that bill resulted in dropping both police and fire from the low 20s, which really is way below any standard and expectation of fiscal viability in the long term, to 17 or 18% looking forward. That's critical because it means basically we're paying what we deduct from workers' paychecks for their pensions in the future. We're almost paying straight to current pension obligations.
That's right.
Current beneficiaries, which means there is no room for error whatsoever in an environment in which we're all waiting for the next shock. It's coming, but we have no preparation, and that goes also to the issue of reserves as well. And so that's all extremely worrisome. Back to the state, there are a couple of things that hover out there that really worry me. During the fall veto session, the We Are One pension legislation that would completely undo Tier 2, which is this second tier that was created to render the state's pension system more stable for purposes of catching up over time. There is an effort that was initiated last year. We had hearings in the veto session, will come up in the spring session this year, of completely undoing Tier 2. The consequence will be adding $52 billion in obligations on top of the $142 billion or so that is owed right now in unfunded. That is enormous. There's another consequence of this that people aren't talking about. It would undo Tier 2 for the localities, and no one has calculated what the actual consequence is going to be for cities, towns, villages across the city, across the state, including the city of Chicago. But it will certainly add tens of billions more in unfunded liabilities. These are things that actually are the tipping point for cities that already are on the edge. So that needs to be closely watched for. One thing that I don't think is on the radar screen that needs to be on the radar screen is the Chicago Public Schools fiscal fragility. And the note, and there, same sort of situation. It's already in junk bond status with respect to its borrowing capacities, and the teachers and the municipal employee benefit funds are grossly underfunded. And I have a feeling that there's going to be a hard push coming from the CTU and interests aligned with the mayor to actually put all of this on the state to the tune of hundreds of millions to $1 billion more a year. And that's not even on the agenda, but that hangs out there. And so it's another thing on top of all of the things that the state is going to, the governor's going to have to, the legislature's going to have to juggle. But there's a lot of blind spots, and it's going to be a complicated session.
Well, I totally agree with the governor, and I appreciate that he's been pretty forceful in his wording about how they should not come to Springfield asking for more money at this time, that they have not proven that they know how to manage the money that we've handed them already. And the fact of the matter is that, what's the average student spend? About $31,000 or so, and they're producing right now at this time like the worst results for these children that we've seen in a long, long time for the most amount of money invested in those efforts. And so, I don't know any other entity, business, or nonprofit that could say we're doing a much worse job with our results, but we need you to keep giving us more and more money. And so I do think, I appreciate that he said no, that's not going to happen. And I know that they'd like to bully that into happening, but it appears to me that common sense needs to prevail here. And, there should be some expectation of oh, look at these amazing results. Then this is working. Let's keep putting, more investments into that, because all of us want to see our kids succeed. I'm a CPS mom. So if anybody here in this conversation wants to see our children succeed, I do. But we have to figure out, this clearly isn't working. We're giving you more money and you're actually producing worse results. Somebody has to have that adult conversation and say, no, come to us when you're producing better results, or why is it that these results are so bad? And it's not because we're not giving you enough money. It's what's it going to take? Because investments should have great return on those investments. These are hardworking taxpayer dollars that are being invested into our children. And as any parent or taxpayer would expect, there should be a visible good return on that investment. And we're not seeing that right now.
And schools and governments aren't businesses, but business model principles need to be applied to at least tell us where we're out of alignment. And when you noted approximately $31,000 per student in annual expenditures across the system, that doesn't tell the full story, because we both know that there are schools that are kept open that cost nearly $100,000 per student because the business model
you
has
could
failed.
send them to University of Chicago for that.
Yep.
Literally.
Yep.
And so that's, to your point, this is the average, right? The 31,000. And how is it that we're spending that amount of money, the much more, the closer to $60,000 or $80,000 per student, and they're still not able to pass reading and writing or arithmetic?
So people might rightly ask, well, then how is it that they continue to get away with it? And that goes a little bit to how the budget cycle works, back to the month of May. Those big fiscally consequential pieces of legislation that results in more money without any sort of criteria or requirements attached to them related to performance, which is supposed to be under the state constitution, state law, and the local codes. The primary mission is to educate students. How does that happen? Again, late in the session, late in the budget cycle, suddenly we see a bill land, and at a point in time when a lot of legislators are distracted, and it's basically throwing a baseball through a car wash and having it not get wet because nobody knows what they're voting on, and yet they vote on it.
Well, I think that's the key. Look, I mean, you have to know that this is coming now.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not like, oh my goodness, this is the first time that, something has been thrown in the final hours of a session. And there's a strategy behind doing this. But like, we have to get to a point as a state where we realize like we can't afford to continue to mismanage money in this way, or as a city to mismanage money in this way and just give in to those pressures. Because at the end of the day, the most important thing is to, as I continue to say, stretch the value of every dollar for maximum impact. And when you see that what you're doing isn't working, continuing to do the same thing and even add to that is only going to make it worse, right? So we always say about like, how do we get a handle on finances? Like the first step to getting out of debt is to stop digging yourself into more. And I feel like it's the opposite that's happening with Chicago public schools in particular.
Well, because the problems are so big that most people tune out. And at the end of the day, can all these problems be solved? Over the long run, yes. There's a saying, the Jewish tradition, there's no problem worthy of us that can be solved in a single lifetime. You have to make the effort, right? And I think that the taxpayers, the residents of the city, businesses, and the financial markets all appreciate simply if we make the effort that sends the signal that we get it, right? And so there we are. We have a herd of elephants. We don't know what to do with it. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And so we just have to start the work.
And maybe we shouldn't be taking our financial advice from an entity that has proven to be literally the worst fiscal operator in the entire state of Illinois, right? So, I mean, let's start with that.
Yeah.
But maybe we start taking a little bit more advice from folks that actually understand the principles here related to driving economic growth and driving education towards a system that everyone can be proud of, right?
Yeah.
Because the beauty of our Chicago public school system is that when it thrives, everyone wants to be a part of it. Everyone wants to be a part of it. But when you see the percentage of teachers in Chicago that are part of the Chicago public school system who choose to not send their own children into it, that should tell you something about the level of confidence in the system, and that is a problem that needs to be fixed.
So I don't want to take your thunder away, but I'll also use the moment to say that my two children were graduates of the Chicago public school system, and they're very successful. One's a law professor here in town now.
Yep.
Good results can happen, but
Yep.
good results only happen if there's accountability, and that's what's missing right now. That's what we need in a new elected school board once it's completely separate, is accountability that's actually tied to the North Star being results,
100%.
situating young
Yeah.
people to succeed in life.
100%. Look, and I believe in Chicago public schools because I'm sending my most beloved treasure there myself, right? You did with your kids, I do with mine. And it's the same reason why I want to see wonderful results and high expectations for our kids who are being taught in every single school in Chicago. And it shouldn't just be certain neighborhoods that have good schools that are operating, right? It should be every child born in this city or that moves to this city that has access to a school being like, yes, my neighborhood school is great. But, like, I'm just a regular family. My husband and I, we moved to our neighborhood, which is not the wealthiest neighborhood. It's just a normal, hardworking neighborhood. But we live in Portage Park. And we moved there because we thought, well, we definitely want our son to go to Chicago Public Schools, but we need to move to a neighborhood that's safe and that has, as a default school, if he doesn't get into like the lottery for a magnet school, that the neighborhood school is a good school, or at least a relatively good school, right? And so we moved there because our neighborhood school would have been Smizer. And he went to Smizer, and honestly, we had a great experience. I'd recommend it to any family. And then thankfully, he's a smart kid, so he was able to test into the academic center at Taft, and we're thrilled. He loves it. He's in robotics. He's in, marching band. He has extracurriculars. Every kid in every Chicago school should have extracurriculars, right? There are certain schools where they have none of that. But, there's a lot that has to be fixed. But I'm telling you, I believe in the system, but we need to demand as parents and as taxpayers better results coming out of those schools for the money we're putting into them.
Across the board, absolutely right. And I think one of the problems that we have locally, we also have it at the state level with respect to what people think Illinois and Chicago is, our narrative right now. Our narrative is tied to the negative results. There's lots of good things happening.
Exactly.
And if we would actually structure our systems to the good things,
yeah,
we would actually
and
be changing
replicate
the narrative.
that,
Absolutely.
right? Because a lot of the good things are happening for a lot less than
Yep.
the $31,000.
Absolutely.
And it's amazing to me when I go and I see these schools that are performing at a fraction of the cost and are doing tremendous work, and the kids are all happy and they're smart and they're engaged and they're graduating at high rates.
Yep.
I was just at Rickover Naval Academy. They have like 100% college acceptance rate, and their average scholarship offer is $100,000 per kid. I mean, it's really amazing. We need to look at those schools and say, what are they doing? And let's replicate that in the schools that are not pulling their weight. So we can talk about this issue forever, but anyway, we love our schools. We want them to thrive. And so there's, this is the never-ending issue that no matter how great we're going to make them, we still want them to be better, of course.
But we need those schools so that we're actually creating the fundamental labor supply for there to be economic growth
The skilled
and development.
workforce.
The skilled workforce.
You got it.
Absolutely.
So we're perfectly positioned for it,
Yep.
right? We just need to figure out a better way of doing it. And so let's move on to the next thing, because we were talking pensions and the buyout option for pensions. What do you think about it? I mean, there hasn't been one for the city of Chicago in like all of eternity. I feel like not since Mayor Daley maybe did they offer a buyout option.
Yep.
The state of Illinois has done it for several years in a row. This year it expires, but my guess is they'll probably try to offer it again because it saves significant amount of money on the back end of the pensions. But what are your thoughts on that?
It's one of the tools in the toolbox that is necessary in order to eventually get to solving the larger problem that we have, the catch-up that we have. And that's been a successful program. In an ideal world, there would be bigger success, but it works fundamentally. And so if we're not talking about renewing it, then we're not talking about actually solving the problems. And so, yes, and it's something that comes up quietly in conversation with respect to the city of Chicago. The fact of the matter is, it's not going to change. It only changes things at the margin, but it in the context of the pension situation, it's quarters in the couch and every quarter adds up.
Every quarter matters, yeah. I mean, have you been paying attention to what my office champion paying pensions early?
Yep.
And I mean, it's not going to solve the pension crisis, but I'm super glad that we generated $43 million in additional interest for those, or returns for those pension funds, because all we did was manage the cash flow better, right? But it was crazy to me that by state law, I could only pay pensions in 1/12 increments before we made this change to the law. And now that we're doing better, we've got our finances stabilized statewide, not the city, but the state. I've got things under control. I thought, well, how else can we add value to taxpayers and look at every possible opportunity to create value? And so if I have better than expected revenue months, the best thing to do from my perspective is always save for a rainy day and pay down pensions, right? Add more than we need to or pay them quicker, because for every day that I can pay a pension sooner than the expected due date, that's an additional day that those pension funds are generating returns, right? Good or bad, but usually good.
Yep.
And the compound interest is our best friend. So we moved to allow me to not have to pay pensions only once a month, but could potentially pay 2 or 3 months of pensions at a time in a good economic month. And then I don't have to worry about coming up with a big pension payment, let's say in a really hard month where revenues for the state aren't that great. But what it's done is really done a good job of returning, just letting the money work better for the pension fund instead of us having to work harder to come up with pension funds. Does that make sense?
It absolutely makes sense. And one of the things, when we tend to talk about these things, people tune out because we're talking big numbers, we're talking what they think is complicated. Actually, what you are talking about is simply a government level version of what ordinary people do with their monthly budgets in their households.
You got it. We're asking, it's really not rocket science, right? Because people do it every day at home. Every day people have to have the conversation of, yes, little Jimmy would love to go to Universal Studios every year, but we can't even afford a bike for little Jimmy this year. We definitely can't go to Florida, okay? So it's like you have that responsible adult conversation with your spouse, or if you're a single parent, even more so with yourself, right? You've got to like tighten the belt. You can't buy those things that you want, but you have to focus on what you need. And I don't think we do that nearly enough by any stretch of the imagination when we're in government. Like government is like, hey, we're spending other people's money, so cool. I literally feel like I'm gonna get hives when thinking about spending people's money irresponsibly. Like I shop in my own life trying to save money all the time. Like I shop at Aldi. I don't know, somebody made some post about shopping at Aldi the other, or asking politicians what they pay. Like anyone actually know what they spend in groceries because they assume we don't shop. I don't know, I can't speak for other people, but I'm always in the grocery store and I know how expensive things are. And I'm like, well, you know, I look between Jewel, which is like in my neighborhood, and Aldi, and like I buy certain things at Jewel and I buy certain things at Aldi. And, you know, the people who are in my life here in work, they all know, I don't want to say how cheap I am, but really how fiscally aware I am. And I try to replicate for the state how I would run my own finances at home. So I don't buy something just because it's easily accessible. I'm going to look to see where can I get the best price for that product by the time I need it, because it's not my money, it's taxpayers' money. And we have to honor their hard work, just like I honor my hard work or my husband's hard work, and we try to get the best bang for our money. Why? Because then you have more money left over for emergencies or for those special things that really matter to you. And the state budget is the same way, right? Like when I can save money for the state and return it back to the Treasury, that means that there's more money available in case of an emergency or for safety net hospitals down the road, for things that really, really matter. And I think if all government officials looked at that responsibility in that way, we'd be way better off as a state, certainly as a city, but not enough of us do. And I don't know why. What do you think? Why is that?
Because the money always continues to come, because we've always been able to rely upon Washington. And so if there is a silver lining to the dark cloud of what's going on in Washington right now, it actually should kind of straighten our thinking. You mentioned Aldi's, right? And Aldi's is something that, you know, people over the years would say, okay, you're cheap, you're right. And
I love Aldi.
I love Aldi. Aldi's is now a metric for where we are on affordability. It is the fastest growing supermarket chain in the United States. Why? Because people are pressed on the affordability front. And we don't connect up affordability as it's experienced by regular people, the taxpayers, when we think about how we're using taxpayer money in government. We separate that out. One of the things that they have to pay for is government, and government should be delivering fullest services, but it's an affordability moment. And if government isn't thinking about affordability as to how it goes about its business, then we're missing our obligations and responsibilities.
You're totally right, because people at home are only thinking about that. Yep. I don't know anybody who's just like, yeah, I don't really care what the price tag is. Like everyone wants to have the best deal because they understand that that's their money and they're going to safeguard it. And I think that there's too many in politics or in elected office that just, it's like other people's money, so it's easy to spend. And I thankfully don't think that way. But it was funny though, that I made this post about, yeah, like here's my receipt for like what I spent it. Like this stinks, right? And then it was like, hey, how, you know, this is like some phony thing. How's an elected official shopping at Aldi? Don't your husband have a job? It's like so funny, like what the animosity and the feelings that people have out there. But it's because I think there's this real disconnect between, you know, government officials, the general public. There's a distrust that obviously exists, right? We hear about this drive to like, you know, reinstate the progressive income tax, which, you know, I supported in years past. But the reason I think that failed and it will continue to fail is because, number one, governments haven't showed a desire to trim their own fat. Number one. Number two, governments aren't trusted by the public to actually spend the money in a way that shows respect for their hard-earned tax dollars. And number three, there's zero transparency as to how those dollars, if raised, would actually be spent, right? So those are three easy reasons why it didn't pass before and why I think it's going to continue to have, an uphill climb, even if one could argue that, yes, maybe there's a revenue problem and not a spending problem. But I don't think we've proven that we don't have a spending problem, because clearly in the city of Chicago, there's a massive spending problem. Mm-hmm. It's been forcefully articulated that the mayor's job is not one to make cuts. I disagree. Like, the mayor has to figure out how to balance a budget just like a household family would have to do, and just like the governor and the legislature has to do. So when the mentality is we're never going to cut, and we're just going to spend, and it's never enough. Well, I don't think there's any chance that taxpayers are going to buy into that. So right. I think, for me, I think about how do we get our state and how do we get the city of Chicago, which is absolutely fundamentally critical to the state's success from an economic perspective or a revenue perspective, to thrive is you've got to figure out how you're going to be responsible with the finances. And if you can't do that, the state of Illinois, no matter what we've done, is looking at an uphill climb in the future.
Nobody believes that it's impossible for government to deliver more with less money at this point. Everyone believes that is possible, and everyone is right. Going back to my time as Inspector General, said people wouldn't necessarily read those reports. They all pile up. Every single time there's a critique, it's an opportunity. And
totally.
We do not seize those opportunities. And I don't think we need to solve everything all at once. I think people just need to see that we acknowledge what we can do immediately, what's within our grasp. And that's what each budget cycle should be, and with more of an orientation towards performance metrics. How do we know in the next year that we're actually delivering the thing that we just asked people for? We don't view it in that way. And so...
Yeah, but you know who does, though? The credit rating agencies.
Absolutely.
They look at everything we do,
and the narrative
makes a difference.
The narrative has changed on that. So for folks, the credit rating agencies decide what our grade is that determines how much we pay to borrow money, which we need to do for all sorts of purposes.
Roads, bridges, infrastructure. Let's say you're building a new school or a new hospital and it's state funded. We have to borrow that through bonds.
Right. And they and these rating agencies, which the financial markets look at to determine, market costs for bonds and so on and so forth, they used to talk with respect to the confidence level that they would have that the city or a government would be able to pay the bondholders. They don't talk that way about Chicago anymore. They talk about the structural deficits.
That's right.
They talk about unsustainable revenue sources because we keep going back to the taxpayer, asking for more in taxes, more in fees, more in fines. And the rating agencies understand that gravy train is over. And if government doesn't respond quickly, things will start to fail.
100%. My parents are Mexican immigrants. So they taught me how to speak Spanish. And I am fluent in English, in Spanish, and in credit rating agency speak. Mm-hmm. Like, I look at what they say every time they give us an upgrade or every time they weigh in with a report. I am looking at that and reading in between the lines. They don't ever tell you this is exactly what you need to do. But those smoke signals, you have to learn to interpret what they say. It's almost like an Ovaltine code, right? But you figure it out and you're like, they're telling us what we need to do to put ourselves in the best position to earn an upgrade. Super easy to earn a downgrade.
Yeah.
Very difficult to earn an upgrade. And we've now had 10 on my watch, and I'm very proud of that. But it's super scary to me to see that the city continues to go in the opposite direction. And that means, what's that going to mean for taxpayers?
Yeah, so a couple of things about that. So if they don't give you the checklist of what to do to earn an upgrade, what they are saying consistently is what you absolutely should not do, and we're ignoring that at the state, at the local level. The state understands that. Absolutely, you're part of that. Consequence to the taxpayers end up being cost of borrowing goes up. Right now, 40% of the net operating expenditures of the city of Chicago go to debt service and pension obligations, which we're way behind on. People traditionally, my predecessor talked about in terms of tax burdens, right? There's something that we tend not to talk about, and it's called the crowding out effect. The money that we are spending for debt service and pension obligations is money not being spent on the services that people actually are paying the money for.
Exactly.
Which means we're giving them less while asking them for more.
That's exactly right. And so that's a perfect point to talk about taxes, right? Because, people say, just, tax the rich or go tax all these businesses and for short-term gain, by the way, right? Mm-hmm. We're not doing anything to fundamentally change our structure that is completely unbalanced, right? That is, it's broken. We're going to keep spending, and the only way we can do that is if we tax the rich. And by taxing the rich, which they mean the business community here in Chicago, who are creating the very jobs that we need working people to have, right? We're going to, maybe we get a year, 2 or 3 of a pound of flesh from them in new taxes for whatever the new spending initiatives are. But on day one, they're already preparing their exit plan out of Chicago and Illinois by year 3 to year 5. And so you're essentially, cutting off your nose to spite your face. And, I hope it feels good for people to say, yeah, we're going to eat the rich and tax the rich and businesses have to pay more. But you're not going to feel that great in year 5 when they've left. And now the few people left that don't make anywhere near the money that left Chicago are stuck paying a whole lot more. So it's really just an issue of math. I really hate it that ideology gets in the middle of all of this and it clouds people's reality. Because the reality of it is that 2 + 2 is always going to equal 4. And when we think that by taxing people out of Chicago, we're actually going to do 2 + 2 = 1 million, we're absolutely wrong every day of the week. And we're hurting the very people who most need the city and the state to do better economically, right? The only way we improve people's livelihoods in Illinois and in Chicago specifically is by growing our way into a more prosperous tax base that will then allow us to get a handle on property taxes. Maybe even someday envision property taxes going down, right? But it's the only way to get out of this. It's not by taxing people out of our city or out of our state.
And at the end of the day, what we're talking about are sugar highs. And everyone knows what happens after the sugar high wears off. You crash.
And you get diabetes, which
raises our healthcare costs. Exactly. We don't have the safety net hospitals for it. Everything is connected.
Not only are you crashing, but now you got diabetes. So yes. So we got to stop that. This is not like, again, we're talking, it's not rocket science, but there has to be a will to do it. And it's difficult for elected officials to tell people no. Yep. But I have to tell my 13-year-old no all the time. He would love to go to Universal Studios every year, if possible. We can't afford it. So he has to learn fiscal discipline, and we've been teaching him very young. Fiscal discipline is important, but we ourselves have to learn that. And lastly, before we wrap this up, I want to talk about one more thing, which is the state's rainy day fund. We are now at $2.4 billion. We started off when I took office I think we were at 48,000. That's not enough to cover 30 seconds worth of government operations. Mm-hmm. Thankfully, we are now at $2.4 billion, the most in history. But help me drive this point home that that's not nearly enough. Because I'm going to keep, as controller, talking about how we need even more money in the rainy day fund. Because $2.4 billion sounds like a lot, but that's about 15 days worth of reserves for the state of Illinois. And especially going into uncertain times with the federal funding, maybe it's there, maybe it's not, maybe it's there. Like every day, it's like Chicago weather, up and down, and who knows. We should still look at that as something we don't want to tap into. And the average state in the nation has about 50 days worth of reserves. Mm-hmm. So that's 50 versus 15 from us. So what are your thoughts on that? There is this appetite to people look at that and say, whoa, it's raining. But, I hope that the Civic Federation can continue to be we have to keep increasing that rainy day fund and keep stabilizing pensions every opportunity we get.
Fundamental to our message, fundamental to our work, but as to the size of the rainy day fund, which you have built from literally nothing, that's enough to handle the fluctuations that come from the fact that most budgeting is based on projections. It's estimates. And we don't know how things are going to work out, right?
Thank you for saying that.
That's fundamental. The reason why $2.4 billion is not enough, given how long it actually could fund the state relative to where everyone else is what hangs over us is what we do if there is a shock that is unexpected altogether.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
That's not enough to handle a shock. What that does, if it's set at the right level, is it creates a buffer for us to figure out how to handle the shock that doesn't have immediate consequence. And we know who's most affected by the immediate consequences. If the state has to turn the dial off on services, it's those that are historically disinvested, those that most rely upon government services.
That's exactly right.
And there's a ripple effect to that. We can go all the way back to safety net hospitals again.
No, it's true though.
Yeah.
That's it. And I always think of myself like I saw this reporter who described, so when somebody said, do you think they're going to tap into the rainy day fund? And I think the best compliment I got all that year was, no way. Mendoza is going to guard that thing like a Knights Templar with sword and shield. And I was like, yes, this is good. I think I'm driving the point home that no, this is a break glass in case of emergency, and it really has to be an emergency. And by that, I mean the stock market crash of 2008, 9/11, unfortunately, that crippled the whole country for a while, right? And obviously the pandemic is a perfect example. We were, it was horrible what happened in the pandemic, but we did get a safety net from the federal government to help us get through that. With the others, you don't, right? So if there is a economic collapse through no fault of our own that lasts more than a couple days, right, you absolutely need to have that buffer there.
And what's different about now than other times, it's more important that we have that reserve, because one thing that we know is the cavalry is not coming this time.
Oh,
we
for
have
sure.
to handle it ourselves.
For sure, which is why, again, I will preach, always err on the side of caution, because we have to get through these budgets. So these budgets should be as tight as possible, providing really looking internally in every department, including my own, which we do every year as controller. We always try to return money, really be tight on all of our expenditures. And at the end of the day, if everyone does that, there's every little reserve, every quarter that you find on the couch is really important, and it's a testament to respecting taxpayer dollars.
And there's one thing that the Comptroller's Office actually is a go-to source for understanding that I think it's time for to be elevated, and that's the number of units of government that we have in the state of Illinois.
Oh, yeah.
And it's thousands. It's twice as much as the next state. The next state is Texas, but there's no income taxes in Texas, and so they tax in a completely different way. Here's the point. We have hundreds and hundreds of townships that perform almost no meaningful service.
No, there's over 1,000
1,700
units, of government.
of
That's
townships.
Right.
We have over 800 school districts that are ripe for some form of consolidation in various places. That is how we do more with less money.
For sure.
And all of it feeds into, going back to the property tax bill, people look and they see all of these units of government. They don't understand what they're for
That's right.
and what they're doing. And in many instances, they're not doing very much at all.
That's right. So, hey, have you talked to Representative Tracy Katz-Mule on this issue?
Absolutely.
So are you aware that we're kind of working on something right now? Yes.
And she has asked for the Civic Federation to jump into that space with her,
great.
having
Excellent.
read reports that we've done recently on this.
That's excellent. So we'll be talking then, you and I, on this issue, because I do think her approach is novel and unique, and it's fun in that we're kind of approaching this as a dating website for townships. Because right now, the narrative is always no one wants the change, right? It's change is scary, and everyone has their little fiefdom, and there's thousands of them.
Two things everybody hates: the way things are and change.
But let's say it was Joe and Susanna, and we were each a township. But we can make the case, and the controller's office can be this independent entity that just deals with numbers, right? That looks at here are the facts, the data, and here's this person's data or this entity's data. And we have Township Joe and Township Susanna, and we're next door to each other, basically doing the same things, that we don't have to eliminate your township or eliminate my township, but we're now the Joe Susanna Township, right? So it's let's create a scenario and start this off instead of adversarial where we're eliminating you from existence, but say, hey, let's date and we get married, right? I'm already married, Joe, I'm taken, sorry. But I'm just saying, this could be a fun way of approaching really good, collaborative, people who believe in finding these efficiencies and actually producing better returns for taxpayers by coming together. I think that's a really innovative way of thinking about this, and that's where you should start.
Absolutely. It overcomes compartmentalization, it overcomes suspicion, fosters dialogue along the lines of shared services, and that's what should be happening across government.
Yeah, once you start showing, it's kind of like you got to get those first folks to buy in, and once they do, then you can replicate that model and say, look what they've been able to do here, and constituents will feel better about it. And you talked about the property tax bill, and I know I said we were wrapping up, but we're really going to wrap up now. But the last thing is, on that property tax bill, if you're in the city of Chicago, like what's the first thing you see on that if you're in a certain area? Do you know where I'm going here?
No.
The first line item?
TIFs.
TIFs. You got it.
Yeah.
So if you're in a TIF district in the city of Chicago, you got your tax bill just recently in December. The first line item, if you're in a TIF district, is the name of your TIF. And people are like, what the heck is this? And why am I sending so much money to this TIF district? And TIFs have really become like a boogeyman. They've been misrepresented by folks with an agenda, right? And I just have to tell you that TIFs are probably the most important economic development tool that municipalities across the state of Illinois have. And my office actually collects the reports on how these funds are being spent, wisely or not, from all the municipalities across the state of Illinois. And were you aware that the only municipality in the entire state of Illinois who utilizes TIF funds for slush fund purposes, essentially, to pay for operating expenses instead of their intended purpose, which is to pay for economic development projects within the boundaries of a TIF district, the only ones who do that are the city of Chicago.
I did know that. I knew that partly from you. I knew that partly from our work. There's something I do want to say about that. The old narrative was, use the term slush fund, is a slush fund for clouded contractors, right? The special interests.
Like developers, for people who,
Ironically, it has been well critiqued by this administration on those lines, but it's become is a slush fund for lazy budgeting and governance.
Bingo. So TIFs were never intended when they were created by the legislature to be utilized to pay for operating expenses of a government unit. And it is really obscene to me that the only ones who do it is the municipality called Chicago. And they don't do it in little amounts. I mean, it started off in maybe like 50, I think it was like 50 million or 100 million.
It was 50 million,
And then now has made its way in the latest budget that the city just passed, $1 billion of economic development, which will never happen in the city of Chicago. That $1 billion is gone, and it went to pay down the addiction to spending the city of Chicago has.
Sugar highs.
And that really should be criminal.
Future. That's our future. And we are basically siphoning off the money that we need to grow. Growth is the only way out of where we are
100%.
Right now. And so this is really, there's no consideration of what the real purpose of TIFs were and what the real benefits of TIFs are. And that has to change.
Yeah, and why don't you explain what a TIF is? Because you and I get into all these terms, and maybe the people watching are like, "What are they talking about?" So
it's a defined geographic boundary, and as
it means tax increment financing, just for people who don't know.
Tax increment financing, and what happens is when a TIF district is declared, there is a determination of the value of the property, the taxable value of the property in that district, and everything that grows in the way of property values from that point in time goes into the TIF accounts for the purposes of economic development. And so if we are not using that money for economic development, then we are basically violating the fundamental premise that we've gone to the taxpayers for in the first instance in creating this. We have no economic development to the benefit of the people in that district. We are squandering our future prospects. It's supposed to be tied to infrastructure that we can't pay for out of pocket, for jobs, things that bring jobs that we otherwise can't pay for out of pocket in real time. All of that is gone. We are giving away our future.
And maybe mention a couple examples of where TIF has really worked to develop in the city. Can you think of some? I can think of a bunch.
I know you have a whole bunch.
Like
that's
Roseland
what you do.
is a perfect
Yeah.
example. Pullman, actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a perfect example of how Pullman was brought back to life and continues to be.
Yep.
Through the use of TIF dollars, because TIF dollars, the city will leverage a certain percentage of them, but multiply them with the private investment that comes in for that. So there's like Gotham Greens and, just all kinds of cool developments that happened in Pullman because of TIF dollars. Another one, like a neighborhood that most people would think of as a depressed neighborhood that desperately needs development would be Inglewood, right? Very poor community. The city leveraged $10 million in a TIF. That then brought in $50 million in private investment. They now have a grocery store. They had no grocery stores. Now they have one. It started off with the Whole Foods. So you'll hear the critics say, well, Whole Foods left. We gave them all this money and they left. Well, no, the money was for the bricks and mortar of the store, that even though Whole Foods left, at least there's a bricks and mortar store there. Now they have a Save-A-Lot. And the folks in Inglewood have a grocery store. They have a health clinic. They have a Starbucks. They have an affordable housing center there. But if you go 2 blocks in any direction from there, there's vacant lot after vacant lot after vacant lot or boarded up home. They need every penny of TIF dollars possible, but $8.8 million of their TIF was swept to pay for, irresponsible spending that the city can't get under control. And so that's another $8 to $9 million of lost economic opportunity for that neighborhood. And like that, we could tell the story up to the tune of $1 billion in lost economic growth. Because once you spend that TIF dollar, it goes away, right?
And once that TIF dollar is swept, it's no longer for the benefit of the people who are actually paying the amount of money to fund that TIF. And so you think if you understood what TIF was in the first instance and what you were paying for, the premise is it's going back into my community. When it gets swept, it's going anywhere.
Yes. And it doesn't, it can go anywhere. And by the way, the city of Chicago, when they swept $1 billion worth of TIF, they only get to keep 220 million of that.
Right.
So it's like taking out the worst possible deal for taxpayers, because 13.5 cents of every dollar goes to the county. So theoretically, even though it was meant for Inglewood, it could be spent in Mount Greenwood or some other place, right? The part of it goes to
53% goes to the schools.
The majority goes to the schools.
Yep.
And it's not going to actual kids though, right? It's going to, pay for the teacher's contract and pay for other things that the teachers got out of that deal, but it's not going to the kids. I think parents would feel better if they knew it was going to bricks and mortar.
Yep.
So like in other words, when your kid's roof has a leak in it, go grab a bucket, because the money that was supposed to be spent on fixing that roof has been spent. It's gone. So these are like we need to start talking about these things more and explaining to the public what's really happening under their own nose. And so rather than just complain about it, which, we all love to do, and I certainly have been calling this out, I'm very disappointed that the city council, approved sweeping $1 billion worth of economic development potential for our city. But I'm not just going to critique it. So you always say, like, here's the critique, but how do we fix this? And so I'm introducing legislation this year in this legislative session that would prohibit municipalities from sweeping TIF funds, using them as a slush fund for operating expenses. And so, we're looking forward to sharing the details of what that's going to look like once we file our bill. But I've been working with experts in this field, people who really are committed to using those TIF dollars wisely. And we're crafting legislation that I think is going to help solve this problem. It'll make, the job of any mayor more difficult, because you can't rely on just using slush funds to make the tough decisions that Chicago needs, but it's the right thing to do, not just for the moment, but for the taxpayers of right now, but thinking about what the future of Chicago is going to look like from an economic growth perspective for generations to come. So it has to be done.
It makes the job of budgeting year to year harder, but there's a double benefit. One, by making the job harder, it means we actually move towards fiscal responsibility with respect to budgeting, which actually means less burden on the taxpayers. And the other thing that it does is it makes sure that those TIF dollars go to really what the purpose of the TIF dollars is investing in our future. So it's a both and, even though it's work, we got to do the work.
Hey, I'm going to make a pitch for the Civic Federation to get behind the bill.
All right.
All right. Well, anyway, it's so great to have you here. We could talk about all these, wonky, nerdy, but important things to do, Joe, all day long. But thank you for being my guest today. You are one of the people that I'm always relying on to hear what your thoughts are on any given subject, whether easy or, more importantly, controversial. But I always trust that your heart's in the right place, but also you have one of the best minds in Chicago and our state. So thank you for your efforts in making our city and our state a better and more thriving place to live, grow your business, but more importantly, stay. So thanks for coming. We will see all of you next time for another episode of the Mendoza Podcast.